In the wards built to heal the sick, people were falling ill. Not one or two, dozens, then more than 100. Doctors, nurses, and patients all struck down by the same old disease, typhoid fever. It should have been rare in the country of the 1960s economic boom. Instead, it kept returning to the same hospitals again and again, as if something or someone were feeding it. By the spring of 1966, investigators had reached a conclusion that would trouble Japanese medicine for decades. These outbreaks, they came to believe, were not an accident of bad water or spoiled food. They were deliberate. And so, on a spring morning, police arrested a young resident physician, a man who worked inside one of the very hospitals where the infections had spread. He confessed. He was convicted. The case seemed closed. But it wasn't. Because one scientist looked at the same evidence and reached the opposite conclusion. For 16 years, he stood in courtrooms and argued that the wrong man had been arrested, that the science simply did not fit the crime. This is the story of the Chiba University typhoid case, an alleged poisoning that its defenders say never happened, a confession they called a fiction, and a question Japan has never fully answered. Did the courts convict a criminal or a scapegoat? To understand this case, you first have to understand the Japan of the mid-1960s. The country was in the middle of its economic miracle. Cities were rebuilding, factories were roaring, and a new middle class believed deeply in two things: progress and authority. Doctors were trusted without question. Universities were revered, and most people simply assumed that the police did not make mistakes. Typhoid fever belonged to an older, poorer time. It spreads through food and water carrying a specific bacterium, and by the 1960s, better sanitation had pushed the disease to the margins of daily life. A serious outbreak inside a modern hospital was almost unthinkable. A hospital, of all places, was where the illness was supposed to be beaten, not born. There is a detail about this particular sickness that will matter later, so keep it in mind. The bacterium behind it does not need dramatic conditions to do harm. A small amount, swallowed in contaminated food, can be enough to make a person gravely ill, and it can be grown and stored in a laboratory in the kind of glass culture dishes that any working hospital keeps on hand. In other words, this was a disease that a person with medical training could, in theory, hold in their hands, and that simple fact would later put a target on the back of everyone who worked near a lab. Chiba University, just east of Tokyo, was one of the nation's leading medical schools. Its hospital carried real prestige, the kind of institution where the brightest young doctors trained and where the public placed near total faith. There is one more thing you need to know, and it matters more than anything else that follows. In the Japanese legal system of that era, a confession was treated as king. If a suspect admitted guilt, the courts weighed that admission as powerful, almost decisive proof. The idea that an innocent person might confess to something they had not done was rarely taken seriously. Hold on to that thought, because everything in this story eventually turns on it. The clearest chapter of the outbreak began on the 1st of March, 1966, at Social Insurance Mishima Hospital in Shizuoka Prefecture, at the foot of Mount Fuji. The fever appeared where it had no business appearing. Within 2 months, roughly 25 people were diagnosed, and a deputy hospital director was among those who did not survive. In restraining terms, people who had come to a hospital or worked in one were dying of a disease the modern world had all but forgotten. And Mishima was not alone. When investigators traced the pattern backward, they found a disturbing history. Over the previous 2 or 3 years, the infection had also broken out at the First Department of Internal Medicine at Chiba University's hospital. It had struck workers at a large Kawasaki steel plant in Chiba, and it had appeared near Gotemba, another town in Shizuoka. Across the wider Tokyo region, more than 100 people had been sickened. Look at that list again, because its strangeness is the whole point. A university hospital, a steel factory, a provincial town at the foot of Mount Fuji. These are not places that share a kitchen or a water supply. An ordinary food or water outbreak stays local. It burns through the people who ate from one bad source, and then it stops. It does not leap between a medical school, an industrial plant, and a distant town over a span of years and keep coming back. Ordinary typhoid does not behave this way. It does not politely reappear in a cluster of loosely connected institutions, fade and return. To the investigators, the map of infections looked less like nature and more like a hand, someone moving the disease from place to place. So they asked a chilling question. What if these outbreaks were not outbreaks at all? What if the bacteria had been placed there on purpose by someone who understood exactly how the disease worked? That question narrowed the field of suspects dramatically. To plant typhoid deliberately, a person would need access to live cultures of the bacteria, the kind kept in a medical laboratory. They would need to know how to handle it, and they would need to be close to the very places where the sick kept appearing. The search, in other words, was no longer for a source of contamination. It was for a person, and it pointed inward toward the hospitals themselves. On the 7th of April, 1966, the investigation reached its target. Police arrested a resident physician, about 32 years old, who worked in the First Department of Internal Medicine at Chiba University's hospital. Out of respect for a claim of innocence that has never been settled, this video will not use his name. The accusation was extraordinary. Prosecutors alleged that the young doctor had introduced typhoid and dysentery bacteria into food shared among colleagues, specifically into bananas and into castella, the soft yellow sponge cake that is a familiar treat across Japan. Through those everyday foods, they said, he had infected around 200 medical staff at the connected hospitals, and at least 2 people had died. Then came the piece of evidence that would define the entire case. In custody, the doctor confessed. Remember what a confession meant in that era. To the prosecution, this was the keystone, the single fact that turned suspicion into certainty. A man with the knowledge, the access, and now, apparently, the admission. To many at the time, the matter looked resolved. But the doctor did not stay silent for long. He soon contested that confession, and his defenders would later describe it as something obtained behind closed doors, in the pressured isolation of interrogation. A statement, they argued, that reflected the questioning far more than the truth. And here the case begins to fracture, because a confession is only as strong as the reality it is supposed to describe. If a man says he did a thing, the natural next question is simple: does the physical evidence agree? For most of the people involved in 1966, that question felt almost unnecessary. He had confessed. He had the means. What more was there to check? One man thought there was a great deal more to check, and he was not a detective or lawyer. He was a scientist, and he was about to spend the better part of his life on this single case. His name was Ohashi Makoto. He was an epidemiologist, a specialist in how diseases spread through a population, and he worked at a national institute devoted to preventive health. Where the prosecution saw a confessed poisoner, Ohashi saw a puzzle that did not add up. Epidemiology is, at heart, the study of patterns: who gets sick, when, where, and in what order. And to Ohashi's trained eye, the pattern of these outbreaks did not match the story the prosecution was telling. His argument, kept here in general terms, ran something like this: the timing and the spread of the infections, how they rose, how they moved between sites, how the numbers behaved, did not fit neatly with the idea of a single person seeding a few batches of food. Diseases obey rules: incubation periods, transmission chains, the way an infection ripples outward from a true source. These leave signatures, and to Ohashi, the signatures on this case pointed somewhere other than the man in the dock. It helps to understand what an epidemiologist actually reads. When a disease strikes a group, it does not strike everyone at once or at random. It follows the water, the food, the contact between people. Count who fell ill and when, and a real source produces a recognizable curve, a rise, a peak, a fall, anchored to a moment of exposure. Change the source, and the curve changes shape. Ohashi's point, in essence, was that the curves he saw across these scattered sites did not line up with the tidy story of tainted bananas and cake handed out by one man. The mathematics of the outbreak, he argued, was telling a different story than the confession. So he did something remarkable. He testified for the defense, and then he kept going, year after year, as the trial ground its way through Japan's court system. This was not a quick proceeding. It stretched across roughly 16 years and 3 levels of court. A scientist and a prosecution locked in a long argument over whether the germs could possibly have traveled the way the charge required. It was, in the end, a collision between two kinds of proof. On one side stood a confession, the pillar of the case, weighted heavily by the legal habits of the time. On the other stood a body of scientific reasoning arguing that the confessed method and the real-world outbreak simply could not be reconciled. The courts chose the confession. The doctor was found guilty and sentenced to 6 years in prison. And on the 25th of May, 1982, the Supreme Court's first petty bench dismissed the final appeal. After 16 years, the verdict was settled in law: guilty. But it was not settled in Ohashi's mind. He never stopped arguing that an innocent man had been condemned. In his final years, ill and hospitalized, he was still working on a manuscript about the case. He died in 1992 at the age of 61, insisting to the end that the science had been overruled. So where does that leave us? 60 years on, with the courts on one side and a lifelong dissenter on the other, how should we weigh a case like this? Let me lay out the two readings honestly, and then reconstruct the timeline to see what each one leans on. The first reading is the one the courts accepted. A hospital insider had the rare knowledge and access needed to handle live bacteria. Outbreaks clustered around the institutions he was connected to. He confessed, and 3 separate levels of court, trial, appeal, and the Supreme Court, reviewed the case over 16 years and upheld the conviction. That is not nothing. A verdict tested that many times carries real weight. The second reading is Ohashi's, and the one his supporters have argued ever since. In this version, the confession is the weakest part of the case, not the strongest, a statement drawn out in isolation and later disowned. and the physical pattern of the disease, they say, never matched the crime as charged. Some have gone further, suggesting that a frightening public health scandal created enormous pressure to produce a culprit, that a health ministry, a university, and an anxious press all needed the story to have an ending, and that a single young doctor became that ending. Now trace the timeline against those two readings and notice something. The strongest evidence for guilt, the confession, arrived after the arrest, inside the interrogation room. The strongest evidence for doubt, the shape of the outbreaks, was there in the data all along, before anyone was ever accused. One kind of proof was made, the other kind was found. I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of case where certainty is a trap. I cannot tell you the doctor was guilty. I cannot tell you he was innocent. What I can tell you is that this case sits on a genuine fault line, the place where a legal system that trusted confessions met a science that trusted patterns, and the two gave different answers. And that tension is why the case still matters. It is remembered in Japanese law and medicine not just as an early example of alleged bacterial crime, but as a warning about what happens when a confession is allowed to outweigh the physical world. Some believe the right man was punished. Some believe a scapegoat carried the blame for a scandal no one could otherwise explain. What do you think? Should a confession ever be strong enough to overrule the evidence of the disease itself? The Chiba University typhoid case ended, on paper, in 1982. A verdict, a sentence, a final appeal, dismissed. But endings on paper are not the same as answers. A man was convicted of turning a healer's tools into a weapon, and a scientist gave 16 years and finally his life's last work to arguing that it never happened that way. We are left with the hardest kind of uncertainty. 2 deaths that were real, 200 people who fell ill, a conviction upheld again and again, and a doubt that refused to die with the man who raised it. Maybe the doctor was exactly who the court said he was, or maybe the true story of those outbreaks slipped away in a closed interrogation room and was never recovered. 6 decades later, the file is closed and the question is still open. Some cases end when the gavel falls. This one only grew quieter and never truly ended at all.